This is a series of talks that we're going to be having that are all going to be free and open to the public that focus on the Black history of Key West. So this is the first in this lecture series, which I've titled Shaping an Island, Key West Black History. This project is supported by the Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And this is, the attempt is to build cultural equality by telling stories of the Black community's significant contributions to our local culture and our local industries. Specifically, where I'll be talking about some of the early history. And we've learned a lot of this through artifacts that we have in our collection, some which the Frederick Douglass Black Educators Project has been generous enough to allow us to use within the exhibit that's opening up, and photographs and historical documentation is what we've relied on to garner a lot of this information, because we don't see this history in our history books. We don't see this in the textbooks. The Black history has largely been marginalized over the years, and we're hoping that we are able to, this is a small drop in the bucket as a way to acknowledge, recognize, appreciate, and applaud the efforts of the Black community that has been marginalized within our own island's history. So kind of, I'm going to put this a lot in context. So I'm going to say, we're going to start around the 1800s when the island settled. We're really ruled by maritime industries, and you're going to see that as an influence as we go forward here. And they're dependent on the skills of Black Bahamians and Black Cubans, as sailors, as spongers, as boat builders, cigar rollers, carpenters, you name it, they're doing it. And they're here fairly early, as we'll see. And as I say, the contributions of these people have been marginalized, even though in truth their contributions were vital and valuable and integral to the development of this island. We wouldn't be where we are today without the contributions of the Blacks that came beginning in the 1820s. And as I said, this talk is part of a larger project, which we really should be doing all these years, is recognizing the contributions of everyone. So I'm going to look at the early history here of the Black population, what they contribute, how did they get here, trying to tick some of those and look at our very diverse, and as I say, thank you to the Florida Humanities for funding this. So, and as I say, you've got your booklet if you want to catch up with all the other events. All right, so although the first permanent settlement of Key West does not happen until 1822, we're starting this talk much earlier because I think it kind of lays the groundwork a little bit to understand what Florida is in the South. We've always been a little strange, Florida, let's face it. So what I want to do, and we are strange even in our earlier days, and the Florida is settled by the Spanish in the 16th century, and the institution of slavery in the Spanish colonies was unlike that of other European nations. So Florida, again, being a little different, meaning that we developed, and slavery here looked different than it did in other southern states. Spanish laws granted enslaving people certain rights and protections, so they were a little, it was less harsh in some ways under Spanish rule. And they were really derived from these ancient Roman traditions, and generally they had views that that slavery was an unnatural condition, although they still did it. So not always ideal. But God had created man free, is what they believed, and they established ways that slaves could become free. So it was more of like an indentured servitude in a way, and which is unlike other places in Florida. And a century passes, Florida became somewhat of a refuge for free Blacks and runaway slaves because the Spanish were not as harsh on their slaves and had a slightly different belief system. So people are looking to Florida as for respite away from slavery. It wasn't, of course, all sunshine and state down here, but certainly we were a little bit more liberal than other states, and free blacks and runaway slaves were seeking Florida as a destination while it was still under Spanish rule. So many black seekers came to Florida. They start settling mainly around the St. Augustine area, that in 1738, the governor of Florida at that time, who's Spanish, granted them a plot of land about 2 miles north of present-day St. Augustine, where they could build their own settlement and fort. So this is really the first permanent free black settlement happens in Florida. These individuals were asked to convert to Catholicism. They adopted Spanish names and a Spanish culture, but they could still retain some of their African traditions and their cultures. The settlement was called Fort Musset. And it became the first legally established free African settlement in North America. And this is happening in Florida. Why am I telling you this? Because we're going to see that some of these people, the descendants of some of these people, are going to be our early Key West settlers. So when the Spanish seceded territory to the United States, they gave up ownership, and the United States is going to take over in 1821. There was a viable and recognizable portion of Florida's population who were free blacks. The laws that the Spanish used to govern these free blacks were replaced by severe codes enacted by the United States. They wanted it to fall more in line with other states' laws in the South. And so these free blacks, they were treated like slaves if they can be recaptured. There was a pretty aggressive campaigns, as we'll see. So it changes overnight. The attitude changes the minute the United States takes over Florida. So from this point, this is where I want to start picking up kind of the Key West narrative. I wanted to lay some groundwork so you understood what Florida was doing prior to the U.S., but then with the U.S., and why people start seeking other opportunities. So I want to pick this point, the Key West story up now. So in December of 1821, John Simonton, I know everybody's, if you're from Key West, you hear John Simonton is in Havana, and he purchases the island of Key West for $2,000 from Juan Pablo Salas. We all think it's a great deal considering the housing prices right now. And so the deal was closed, and St. Augustine is still the capital of Florida. So Simonton legs it to St. Augustine in order to, file the deed and the claim on Key West as part of his land. And he's a Mobile, Alabama trader. He's a businessman from there. His leanings are with the southern states. And so, he's imagining that this can be a port like Mobile. He envisions like large expansion around the natural deep water port we have here. And in the early 1820s, the railroad hasn't come anywhere. A railroad really doesn't exist across the country. Most people were moving things via ship. Okay, so you're kind of seeing where we're laying just kind of keep some of these little nuggets as we're going through. Because who were good sailors? If we're basing everything on maritime, who were the good sailors? Who were good spongers? It's going to be the blacks that are moving from the Bahamas. So as I say, everything's maritime based. We don't have a way to move things from point A to point B. And they were determined that this was going to be a maritime city, and the early settlers were absolutely adamant that they would flourish. So I'm going to give you some populations as we go so you can see the increase. There will not be a quiz when this is over. But I want to just kind of draw your attention to some early numbers. 1828 is the first time they actually do a census here in Key West. How many whites, how many free blacks, how many slaves, and the total number and the percentage of blacks, in Key West versus the number of blacks in Florida. This last column is enslaved and free. So you can see that we have relatively low numbers compared to Florida in general. That's because we just don't have agriculture. Most slaves are working in agricultural fields. We don't have that here, nor would we. Our soil is just inhospitable for that. If anybody's tried to grow anything in their yard, it doesn't work as well. Okay, so and plus, the United States had taken over the territory of Florida. We're not yet a state, and there's a deliberate attempt on the part of white Floridians to reduce the small number of free blacks in this newly established territory. They were not encouraging the movement of free blacks to Florida any longer. And as early as 1828, the number of free blacks and mulattoes was limited by an act This is section 48, which is I've quoted up here, that from and after the first day of March next, which would have been 1829, it shall not be lawful for any free Negro or mulatto to migrate or be brought into this territory from any state or territory within the United States. I don't know how much more clear the government of Florida could be about bringing in free blacks to the state of Florida. So any free person of color that came to Florida and remained longer than 30 days per this act up here was liable for arrest and had to make a payment to the local government of $500 in a bond after he or she would have to leave the territory of Florida. You couldn't just pay the $500 and stay. You had to leave within 10 days after paying the bond. If the arrested person was unable to pay the bond, the court could order the immediate sale of the free black or according to them, or the mulatto, whoever, for the term of 1 year. So you can be sold back into slavery even if you were a free black. This is how inhospitable Florida got quite quickly. And under Section 52 of this same act, there's provisions that were not binding on free blacks who were engaged in the contracts of service on board ships. So you can see Key West kind of gets a little bit of a pass. We're going to be this maritime city, this booming, flourishing maritime city, and Florida knows it's dependent upon maritime trades, that it writes laws saying within any of the waters of this territory, so long as the free Negro or mulatto shall remain in actual employ of or on board said ship or vessel, they were allowed to work in the Maritimes as a free black, which spells great success for Key West. Because as long as they were not living ashore, they had to reside on their ships. Okay, so you can see that the way that the laws are being written certainly favor certain areas over others for development. So after the Nat Turner insurrection, slave insurrection in 1831, Florida residents are concerned about retaliations within the slave community. So they enact further laws saying that to control the black population in Florida. Under a territorial law that passes in 1832, it became unlawful. It became lawful for patrols of whites to patrol around for slaves or free blacks or mulattoes, and if they were found with any dangerous weapons or firearms, they were automatically under arrest and then can be sold back into slavery. And in the same year that they passed this act in 1832, Key West actually passes its own act. And the Territorial Council grants Key West the city charter, and under its provisions, it says Negroes, free or slaves, are not allowed on the streets after 9:30 p.m., at which time a bell is rung unless they have written permission, and no store could remain open after bell ringing. Okay, so they're allowing it, but they're not allowing it. It's sort of confusing. Time, especially if you are a free black, where do you go? Where can you actually survive and make a living? It's quite difficult at the time. But there were blacks on this island that came, or the early slaves. They're free black workers that come with the original settlers to help start building houses. There are blacks that come as slaves with their original settlers. And really in our early days, referring back to the population chart, Key West black population originated from two distinct areas. One is the Bahamas, which I think gets, I think we get a lot of attention about the Bahamian migration, which we'll talk about. And we're also getting a lot in the early days from St. Augustine. And really the reason for that is in 1824, they decide to move the capital of Florida away from St. Augustine and move it to Tallahassee. Now, there's a lot of businesses, there's a lot of people working, government jobs in St. Augustine at the time. They decide to move the capital to Tallahassee. And what the Floridians, they had kind of been a bit protected there, the black Floridians, had been safe-ish in St. Augustine. That was no longer the case. They didn't have the government control right there. And there was a pretty large exodus of blacks from the St. Augustine area moving to, they were looking for other opportunities, but they have taken Spanish names. They've converted to Catholicism. What they're looking for is some place where they can go that falls in line with what their culture is. And so they look to Key West, and we have a lot come here, and the majority of them end up moving to Cuba. leaving the St. Augustine area. So we get a lot of our early free black settlers are coming from both of those places. The St. Augustine features a little bit more prominently in those earlier days. But really, notwithstanding wherever they're coming from, the black free males that are moving to the island found employment mainly in these maritimes because they were allowed to do it. They were permitted, by the law as long as they were working on board ships, and that's something they had generally worked on before, particularly when we're talking about the Bahamian blacks who moved to Key West. And a handful of others found work in other industries like the salt industry, which is pictured here. We have the salt ponds in the middle of the island, sort of near Key West High School-ish today. And they recruit blacks from the Bahamas because the Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos had a pretty large salt industry already happening, and they were paying these folks to move here who are already trained in working with in salt ponds and drying out salt and then using it to store meats. So they get them to move here. So they're starting to work in that. And these early white settlers, such as Richard Fitzpatrick, who's a planter from South Carolina, he feels like the salt industry is going to be a thing. So he actually purchases a large amount of slaves. He's one of our earliest and largest slave owners. Understanding, he thinks that we're going to have some kind of plantation system here. He's from South Carolina. That's what he's kind of used to. That's not how it works. But so he ends up doing all the salt farming down here. But he's hiring, his foreman is from the Bahamas. He hires a guy only by the name of Hart. That's all we can figure out in any of the documents, who was brought here from the Bahamas, and he's placed in charge of the entire salt work. So a white guy owns it, and that's what we always hear about, but who's actually doing all the work at the salt ponds was this gentleman named Hart that had come from the Bahamas, were recruited from the Bahamas. And he had about 30 workers there, and most of them were black and came from the Bahamas to work in his salt pond. So that's one of our earlier industries that we can see, aside from the domestic duties, why we get some slave owners and free blacks moving here is because we're starting to have some industries that have availability for their skill sets. Okay, so the British Empire passes an act in 1833 abolishing slavery in all of its colonies. This included the Bahamas. Under Bahamian law, the Bahamians can do like an indentured servitude for a little while after they gain their freedom in exchange for room and board. Which they did, and that they called it an apprentice program. They've been doing the same work all day long, so it's sort of a misnomer. But that had to end on August 30th, 1838. And at that point, you could no longer be an apprentice. You either were paid for the work that you were doing, or you had to find another job. And this led to a disaster for the Bahamians because a lot of the former slave owners who lost their apprentices in 1838 now did not want to pay for the work to be done, whatever industries they had worked in. And so black Bahamians were free to leave their homes, but it was risky to relocate here. We still had slavery in this country. And this look, even though we had a lot of prosperity to offer, the same skill sets could be applied. They can take from the Bahamas, bring here. It was still too risky for a big full move from the Bahamas to Key West or anywhere in Florida because slavery was still legal, and there was a real risk that they could be captured and sold into slavery. So we don't have a big influx right away, and largely because of that. We do have some notables. I'm going to kind of pare down some of the notable people as we go through this. But one of the things that I find really impressive is the movement of black women, especially. And despite our strict antebellum laws in Florida, there were free blacks who located to Key West in the early 1840s. And one of that we know about because it's bad enough we don't hear about blacks in our history books. We definitely don't hear about black women in our history books. So when you can find one and can get a little bit of a history on her, then it's it's gold to really understand the plight of someone who wants to move down here and work and what it was really like moving to Key West. So this is Hannah Brooks. She was known on the island as Aunt Hannah. She was one of two trained nurses on the island. The other one was Ellen Mallory. who we always hear about, right? You never hear about Hannah, and she was a midwife for most of the people on the island, whether they were black or white. Apparently, very successful at it, birthing babies for many years. She lived until she was 102 years old, which is, I think, why we do hear some more information about her as opposed to others. And this portrait, and the fact that her portrait was taken, it was not inexpensive at the time to get your portrait done. This is probably taken around the 1880s. So some family, either herself, she had saved up money, or a family had paid for this for her. But at least we know who she is. We can put a name to it and know that she lived till she was 102 and working. Not quite that long, but certainly well into her older years. So Key West black population was primed to increase rapidly once Florida becomes a U.S. state, officially in 1845. And the government immediately wanted to protect where we were. Like, we were kind of hanging out in the Gulf of Mexico. We're on a major trade route. If anybody wanted to attack the United States, this is a pretty good place to start. Because we're just down here, and we would never be able to get word to anyone until it was too late. They wanted to protect this strategic island, so the government decides to erect a series of fortifications around Key West and the Dry Tortugas. The Army Corps of Engineers had used slave labor to erect forts in other coastal locations around the country, and when it came to building or planning the build of the forts here in Key West, so not just what ends up being Fort Jefferson and Fort Zach, but also the Martello Towers here. So we're having a lot of building happening. We had a small population, if you remember from the slide, and our labor force was not going to be enough. The importation of slaves, as the Army Corps had done before, was the answer to that. So they want to bring in black laborers. So the slavery was this solution, meaning that from the mid-1840s, the Key West black population is going to rapidly increase. And I'm wondering, you're going to say, God, I wish I had some numbers. I'm going to show you. Construction begins on Fort Taylor in 1845 and Fort Jeff in 1847. And so this is a little later. This is the same one. So you can see 1840, the number of slaves we have here is 96. Now, Fort Zach and Fort Jeff start getting built in between these two census, and we end up with 431 and 451. That's an enormous increase in a short amount of time, and that is directly tied to the building of those fortifications, the two large forts and the two Martello Towers. Now, there were supposed to be 4 Martello Towers, so we really needed a lot of people. So what this is we kind of see, and it's interesting, as a sidebar, the number of blacks in 1840, I'm like a numbers person, all right, I'm a numbers person. That's it. Because before the forts are being built, the percentage of enslaved women in Key West is at 58%. Most of them are serving in domestic duties, laundresses, housekeeping, just general property upkeep, and 41% are men. Forts get built. It's absolutely swapped between the two of them because they are importing men now specifically to build those forts. So just, again, kind of seeing that imbalance one way, understanding because we don't have any records of what the slaves would have been doing, but we can see what the male to female ratio, you can hazard a guess, pretty well educated guess about what was happening, and certainly that changes dramatically after the forts start being built. And so how did this work? Okay, slave owners in Key West would buy slaves in a market elsewhere, bring them to Key West, and they would rent them out to the U.S. government for about $1 to $1.12 a day. Some of the money would go to the slave, but the majority of the money was going to the white owner. So it became a business for them. Going to markets in these cities and buying them and bringing them back and automatically renting them out. I mean, some of these slave owners never even saw them. They're the people that they had purchased because they were out at Fort Jefferson for the duration or were brought back here and not necessarily coming home every night. As I said, they're about $1.12 a day what was being paid build all of these forts. So that's how a lot of the locals made some money. And I did have something in here. Let me see if I have it. Okay, so in 1840, just to give you an idea, there was only 5 Key West slaveholders that had more than 5 slaves each. So most families had just a couple each, and I think the majority of them were females. By 1850, now the forts are being built. After the engineers had arrived, 26 people on this island had more than 5 slaves. So you go from 5 big slave owners to 26 in less than 10 years because they're all buying them. Okay, so while this practice of slavery was still legal in the United States on the eve of the American Civil War, the importation of slaves had been outlawed in 1807. So slavery was still legal in the country, you just couldn't bring anyone else in. Like that was going to happen, right? Like they were going to listen, it's lucrative, they're not going to do that. So this prohibition on the importation of slaves was, it did not deter slavers at all. Like they were willing to risk it, to go to Africa, take these people and bring them somewhere in North America, whether that was to, mainland North America, down in the West Indies. They were willing to risk it. And the biggest hub at the time that this happens in 1860 is Cuba. Cuba's the big hub. Their sugar plantations are booming. Everybody's got a sweet tooth around the world now, and they're one of the largest sugar producers at the time. And most of the slavers are coming and trying to drop off and sell in Cuba. So people were willing to risk it. But in the spring of 1860, 3 of these slave ships were intercepted by the U.S. Navy off the coast of Cuba. They're called the Wildfire of the William and the Bogota, and they're escorted to Key West. So they're caught by the U.S. Navy. They have to take them somewhere, and they bring them to Key West, we're the closest port. And there's a total of 1,432 Africans that are brought to Key West on board these slave ships. They're delivered to the U.S. Marshal here on the island, and they have nothing. And so the people of Key West get together. They erect housing for them. They feed them. They clothe them. They give them medical attention while they're here. And again, I'm a numbers person. I always look at this. 1,432 show up on the island. That's about Key West population, right, at the time. So it adds, it's a lot of people. It's like Fantasy Fest week. There's just a lot of people in a space that, is not used to having that many people here. But a total of, because they were so sickly, obviously not well cared for because none were, a total of 295 of them died, and they were buried near Higgs Beach, and I think more ironically near Fort West Martello, and they're using slave labor to build West Martello, around the same time that they're burying free African, that didn't get sold into slavery, right at the foot of that fort. So that happens here. So I think, there's a lot of attention. The newspapers pick up on this. We're really at the center of the newspaper reporting because this wasn't happening in other places. This is happening in Key West, and people are paying attention to it. So as I say, overnight population increased by 50%. They build these barracoons kind of near the southernmost point for them to live. The city really does come together and mobilizes very quickly in order to come to the aid of the Africans that are brought here, who eventually are recolonized, is how they were calling it, and they sent them back to Liberia because that's what they want to do after they get off a ship. A long voyage across the Atlantic is go directly back the other way to a place that they're not from. So, but we have that as part of our history. It's one of the well-known parts of it. But I guess the thing is we mobilize quite quickly to do that. So, but this is all on the eve of the Civil War. The following year, Florida decides to secede from the Union. This is in January of 1861, and we join the Confederate States of America. Key West is technically the second largest city in the state at that point, but we are really the largest and most cosmopolitan by far. We're more diverse than most, and we're the richest by a lot. So people are paying attention to Key West at the state level because we're making most of the money in Florida. So they're looking at us, but they don't want to limit, but they do and they don't. So most of the folks on this island are pro-Southern. There's not a lot of love for the Northerners and the Union on this island, but the U.S. Army is here and the U.S. Navy is already here, and so we just stay Union for the duration of the war. Folks in this town begrudgingly just deal with it because they don't like it, but they're making money. and everyone's allowed to keep operating on this island. And that meant not only the folks that are working, the whites and the blacks, everybody that's working in these industries, we go away almost unfettered through the Civil War. Because we're allowed to. So that allows our population to continue to grow. Where the South is kind of suffering in general, we aren't. And we are allowed to have this labor force keep working. This is just a quote. So both these Union Army and Navy members were stationed on the island, and there's little to do a lot of these days. We're not really we're not Vicksburg. So they spend a lot of time writing letters to their friends and their family, and observations about the island and their residents are included in this correspondence. And so one example, I found was of a black discussion of Key West black residents by Henry Crichton Wise, who was in the U.S. Army. He said, "We had some excitement the other day caused by the quartermaster taking about 20 Negroes from their master and setting them to work for Uncle Sam. This will be at the forts. They tell us in the North that the Negroes are ignorant and incapable of taking care of themselves. Now this is utterly false. Most of the slaves pay their masters $25 or $30 for their time and then work and take little jobs or carry on business for themselves and make money at that. There are nearly as many blacks as whites here, and they dress well, and I think are about as wealthy as the whites." Again, we're different. Key West is different. It's not good. There's a lot of bad in here. But certainly we're an anomaly, and which is why we're worth really looking at and studying, because we are not feeling the ripple effects that other places in the Deep South are. So President Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War on January 1st of 1863, and he announces that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious areas are and henceforth shall be free. And so he inspires, what the hope is that he's going to inspire slaves to rebel and join the Union forces to do that. So how does that land here in Key West? It takes about 3 weeks for news of emancipation to actually reach Key West. And it prompted the excitement, as you would assume, amongst the island's black population. And on January 30th, and the reason we know all this is because there was a correspondent for the duration of the Civil War from the New York Times that was on this island. So there was a lot of information from the New York Times. Again, it has a little bit of a Union slant because he's writing for a northern paper. But we get a lot of information about the emancipation. They have a parade that day. They organize a parade with music and banners, and most participants are dressed according to the correspondent for the New York Times in their Sunday best. The marchers are cheering. They go to houses of anti-abolitionists and abolitionists, both saying, I'm sure, choice words for both sides. And some people were angered by it, I'm sure. And according to the newspaper, one unhappy woman was on her second floor balcony and dumped a bucket of water over the revelers. But it didn't deter them. They went to the barracoons that had been used for the slavers that were brought here in 1860, and they had a party. They had a party to celebrate emancipation, and from that, we really, we'll see some, information on some slides ahead. But they were free. We were a Union outpost, and so that decree came down, and that was, allegedly, I'll use allegedly, the end of slavery on the island. After this Emancipation Proclamation, black soldiers were recruited by the Union. And in 1863, they actually come to Key West to recruit blacks from the island to serve the Union in the Civil War. So they arrive in Key West with the responsibility of recruiting these newly emancipated and free blacks. They sent down this guy named Colonel Montgomery. So a call's put out across the island. Who wants to volunteer for service? If you were between 15 and 50, and volunteer meant you had to show up. It wasn't really volunteer. It was you have to show up and go to the courthouse to determine if you were eligible or not to fight in the war. And more than 120 blacks from Key West are deemed physically able. They show up and they're deemed physically able to fight in the war effort. Although, again, this is not really that well documented. And there's, because some sources say it was close to 200 that actually showed up wanting to volunteer for service. So you see, things, again, were kind of an anomaly down here. They ended up heading to South Carolina for their regiment. We do get colored troops on the island here as well. We get 11 companies from the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops arrive in Key West, and they're stationed on the island during the conflict, but they're being sent all over, mostly to mainland Florida. They are here for a good portion of the time, but they're spending the bulk of their time up on the mainland. So we do get black troops, Union troops, coming to Key West as well. So you're seeing both sides of that. And they participated in some conflict operations on Florida's west coast for the Main Point in about 1864. So, at the end of the Civil War and the arrival of Reconstruction, a greater number of blacks began relocating to this island, acquiring property and building houses. Two of the most recognizable are Sandy and Lily Cornish. Sandy's here. No one knows what Lily looks like. But Cornish is born a slave, in Maryland, and eventually makes his way down to Florida building a railroad in the Panhandle area. And then about 1850, he comes down to Key West with Lily. They bought their freedom. It's a long, drawn-out saga. It's like for another talk. But what I think is really impactful is right in this early Reconstruction era, Sandy and Lily bought 20 acres of land, kind of where St. Mary's is now, St. Mary's Church on what is now Truman Avenue. And so he buys 20 acres, and he is very good at growing fruits and vegetables. And this is what he's known for. People come to his property. So I'm going to kind of give you an idea of where he is. So this is a map of Key West during the Civil War. Let's see here. Here we go. That's all of Sandy's property there in that orange square. And for those of you in the back, again, it's 20 acres of land that Sandy's able to come down and purchase. And by all accounts, he's quite a wealthy, free black. And they all are after the Civil War, but he's here before the Civil War, and he is free before the Civil War, and he's very prosperous. Apparently, he's growing great fruit. And one of the things, again, these correspondents and the people that are stationed here during the Civil War don't have a lot to do. So they write about their daily experiences. And one is that they went to 3 naval officers out to Old Sandy's, as he was called by name, who was an old colored man who kept a fruit garden in the suburbs. St. Mary's is the suburbs. We were ushered into the house and took seats around a square table in the parlor, and then gave our order for some fruit, which he brought to us on individual plates. There were delicious grapes, guavas, oranges, etc. And after we had eaten what fruit we wanted, we each paid him 50 cents, his price per plate of fruit, and then we took a look about the garden and retired. So it's nice to actually get some insight into some of what's actually happening here in this Reconstruction, or during the Civil War and Reconstruction. Okay, so the islands of the Bahamas were prospered during the Civil War. They're making money off of everybody. It didn't matter if you were Union or Confederate. The Bahamians took your money during the conflict. Now, the conflict is over. Everybody's broke. So what are the Bahamians to do? They're not making money. They're not prospering. So these local merchants and laborers who capitalized are now finding themselves out of work. And it forces the economy plummets in the Bahamas right after the Civil War. And they're looking for alternative opportunities to get, looking for work. So they migrate to Key West in search of a better life. A lot of them, this is when we find the larger black migration from the Bahamas. And this surge get ready, here's a table coming. We're going to see a population table. Not only does it demonstrate an increase in whites who are also moving here, but black residents as well. And it's, to me, remarkable. So you can see sort of after the Civil War is over, don't ask about the slave numbers. It's complicated after the Civil War is over. But you can see the free black population right after the Civil War grows from 160 to over 1,000 in 10 years to 3,000, 5,000, and then holds steady. And again, you've got the percentages. 31 to 32% of our local population are blacks. Mainly at this point from the Bahamas or multi-generational that had been here already. So we get a lot. This is when we find that big influx. So these new settlers are looking for opportunities in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and they're finding work in a variety of industries. And this is really how they're, to me, starting to really shape what Key West is. And most of the 19th century Bahamians were making a living by the sea, and that's what they gravitated toward. They were good at fishing. They were good at sponging. They were good at wrecking. They were good at shipbuilding. They were good at turtling, and that's the favorite occupations. And the women who were moving mainly worked in domestic capacities, including laundresses, but everybody could find work here, and you couldn't find that in the Bahamas. So those that came immediately were prosperous here. And with these excellent skills in shipbuilding, these newly settled Bahamians were also recognized as first-rate carpenters, and so they're tapped to start building a lot of the warehouses, people's homes, churches. They're the ones who were doing a lot of the labor for the aggressive building that had to happen. After that Civil War, we started going out into the suburbs past St. Mary's, and we needed people to build those, and that's exactly who was doing it, were the blacks that were moving here who were already skilled in this. So certainly they're physically, not only culturally shaping the island at this point, but now they're physically shaping the island as well. Most went into sponging at this point. Wrecking was kind of on the fallout. So their work, they worked a lot in sponging. I'm going to try to skip ahead a little because I'm a lot behind. They worked in the cigar factories. You'll find many black Cubans are also moving to Key West at the same time, so I don't want to say it's just black Bahamians moving here. There are a lot of black Cubans that also moved to Key West for economic prosperity as well, and they mainly find themselves working in the cigar factories. Land-based activities as well were available. A lot of them worked as draymen. Which means you had to dray your mule and your cart, and you would just transport whatever, wherever. If somebody needed you to meet at the port and put their new furniture in your dray and take it to your house, they do it. You have your cigar rollers having boxes of cigars ready to go to the port to be shipped out. This is who you called. So there was both land-based and sea-based opportunities here, and the demand was too much. There were enough people here to fill the demand, so most people were very prosperous at this time. And then there's a survey done in 1888 about all the black occupations, what most people, and this to me is interesting because you get to see what people are doing, what their job roles are, what was more in demand, less in demand. And the other big thing that comes out in this time period, in this Reconstruction era, is this, blacks in these former slaveholding states, and this included Florida, see education as making the step forward to move away from that era of slavery. They find that education and religion are the two things that are going to propel them forward, and those two are not necessarily separate from one another. They're certainly linked together. So this commitment toward education has lasting effects in these slaveholding, former slaveholding states, I should say, including Florida. And they were allowed to be legislators, and so if they can get into office, which we'll just skip through some photos here of notables, if they can get into offices earlier, they can help establish laws that bring education and churches to certain areas. So on this basis, with this expansion happening in Key West during this time period, the Bahamians moving, and some to a lesser extent the Cubans, the first public school opens for black children on the island, and it's in 1870, and it was known as the Frederick Douglass School. And this is for the famous abolitionist, orator, writer, activist, you name it. He had his hands in it. The school has 4 distinct buildings, which I won't go into right now because we have a lot in the exhibit coming up, so we'll see you there for that. But mostly the buildings get displaced because of the U.S. Navy keeps eminent domaining a lot of property, and the school keeps having to move. And this is a view of the Frederick Douglass School, the first Frederick Douglass School in the 1870s, which was behind the county courthouse on kind of on the corner of Thomas and Fleming. So there's a map. There's, I don't know, that's the custom house over here. Give you a viewpoint. There's the county courthouse, and there's Douglass School in the background there. And so they recruit from all over, the educators from all over. William Middleton Artrell was the first principal of Frederick Douglass School in 1870. He's born in Nassau. He's born and educated in Nassau, and he is brought here specifically to be the principal of the Frederick Douglass School. He's also an alderman in Key West, and he serves as a Key West City Commissioner from 1875 and 1876. So again, we're kind of Florida, not Florida in some ways, because as we'll see, I'm going to go through quite quickly, there are some notable names that are serving high-ranking government offices that are originating from Key West, and they're holding offices here and helping to shape the land. So again, we're shaping Key West. We did it geographically, we did it, culturally, we've done it, architecturally, physically, and now we're doing it, governmentally as well. And so he's a big proponent of anti-segregation. All right, so as the blacks are settling near the seaport, the area where they worked, their children are attending school in the same neighborhood. They attach themselves to this distinct neighborhood that now we all call Bahama Village, even though it's kind of bigger than Bahama Village, and it was never called Bahama Village before. But they've grown this area where the Bahamians and other people of Caribbean culture are settling, and they're bringing with them their architecture, their food, their culture, their music, and their traditions into this neighborhood. So this was called on a map from 1889, which was the Sanborn Fire Insurance map. Where is it? Oh, it's tiny. I think I blow it up for you. So this area here, so Front Street, Emma Street, Thomas, Fleming, Eaton. If I zoom in, that's the same. So they even on the map named that area La Africana on that map because of because that's where all the blacks were living. It was so marked on that map that way. So we have a good idea. So this employment and this education and this community fosters an environment here that allowed for many members of the black community to thrive during this Reconstruction period. Liberal Florida Constitution allowed governors to appoint people to office. Okay, so this is where we get a lot of our notables, and I'm so sorry because I'm going to do like a real disrespect and just keep like blast through these because I want to make sure I'm covering as much as I possibly can. They do deserve more attention than I'm going to provide them tonight. But we have some high-ranking black officials early on during the Reconstruction period in Florida. One of them is Benjamin W. Roberts, who's an African Methodist Episcopal minister, and he's a city official. He's born outside of Key West, but he moves here. And he was licensed to preach in the church. He was appointed by Monroe County. He was appointed as a Monroe County commissioner by Florida's governor, and he also served as a Key West councilman, an alderman, and the collector of customs. So like a slurry of government jobs. James English and Nelson English, who the park is named for. This is the son Nelson, but his father James, who I don't have a photo of, he's one of the St. Augustine lines that comes here and quite early as well. And he moves about 1850, so still when we have slavery in this country. He moves down, he's a barber. He also opens a grocery store when he gets here. And he's appointed by the governor as a Monroe County commissioner from 1868. Now this is 3 years after the Civil War is over, to 1875 he holds that. And he was the first citizen of African descent elected to the county commission, and he was also a member of the local school board. So again, impressive, but this was all at the behest of Florida's governors. This was not locally elected. And then the son, who is pictured here, was born. He became an expert accountant and bookkeeper. He married a teacher at Douglas School, and he was appointed postmaster of Key West. He was the youngest and first black person named to that office. So really impressive. What's happening here? Again, Florida, not Florida. Robert Gabriel, again, this kind of sort of same, he's appointed Key West City Commissioner in 1876, 1878, and 1879. He became the first black in Key West to represent Monroe County in the Florida House of Representatives. Again, impressive. We're shaping Key West, but now we're shaping Florida. I mean, amazing. And like none of this gets really talked about very much. I mean, he's later reelected as a city commissioner from 1905 to 1909. So he's in office and serving this community and the state of Florida for a long time. Charles DuPont, who DuPont Lane is named for, his family is, he was the first popularly elected black sheriff in Florida. So he's done by election. So the voters in Key West and the county vote for Charles to be our sheriff, the county sheriff, which is, again, incredible, kind of coming out of this Reconstruction era and what's actually happening in the rest of the South and seeing what's happening here. There's a lot of similarities, but there's certainly a lot of differences that I think deserve much more acknowledgement. So he serves a 4-year term. in that capacity. We have abolitionists, widely known abolitionists, such as John Willis Menard, who comes here. He writes newspapers while he's here. He's an abolitionist that comes out of Washington, D.C., that wants to come to Key West to promote what's happening in the Black community in Key West and how progressive we are being in certain situations, and allowing our folks to flourish here, and the large number in the population. Judge James Dean was been a little bit more in the news recently. He was not only Florida's the only 19th century Black county judge. He was the first Black county judge on the bench in the South after Reconstruction. So this isn't a Key West thing. This isn't a Florida thing. This is a South thing. He is the first Black county judge to be elected after Reconstruction. He loses his license. Actually, the governor takes it away from him because it's illegal for interracial marriage at the time, and he marries two individuals that have one Spanish speaking, a very Spanish sounding last name, and one not. And it was deemed that this was an interracial marriage, even though they were both Black Cuban, of Black Cuban descent. So the marriage was totally legal, but the governor fired him for all the wrongdoings and breaking the law in Florida, which he certainly did not. So he was removed, but he was reinstated by Jeb Bush in 2002 because they acknowledged that was what they had done to him was wrong. Okay, Cori's got to skip forward. Oh, okay. So I want to just kind of touch on, and we'll kind of finish up, and then you can ask questions for the later period if you want, rather than hearing me talk for a lot longer. But I want to just kind of talk about some of this general influence and what happens after as we move into the 20th century, because certainly Blacks are important, not just in these formative decades of Key West, but certainly well beyond that. They're influential in World War I. They volunteer for service in World War I from Key West, something that does not get necessarily acknowledged here. The other thing, which is kind of neat, is the library holds these waterfront passes, and these were to allow access during World War I to the waterfront area. And there are several of Black workers, and in various capacities, because it'll give you their name, their residence, their nationality, their occupation, who was employing them, and how long, where the pass is good. So where they were allowed to go. And it's incredible the number of men and women, Black men and women, that are on these passes. And it gives us such insight. Not only do we find out where they live. Okay, Lewis Albury, great, residence, Key West. That one's not that helpful. That was a bad one to pick. American, seaman, he can go anywhere he wants on the base. Okay, this one is residence. I can't even read that. Somewhere else. Oh, thank you, yeah. Sideways and, yeah. Those are two bad examples, but they're working here. Oh, look, Galveston. Oh, there we go. Galveston Lane is there, but he's British. Why? I don't know. But, Key West, and we can get a lot of information. This one, this gentleman's a drayman. So again, these gives us a lot of insight in places that we really can't find much information. I know, isn't this cool? We're borrowing these for the exhibits. If you want to see more, just saying, come see the exhibit. Okay, so then we move into the 20s, which you really don't have to, because we all know. Then we move into the Great Depression. And this is something that really hits home, I think, for especially all the communities, actually, in Florida, because everybody was broke. Everybody on this island was broke during the Depression. And the way to come out of it was the government sends down a representative, an administrator, to deal with what can happen. How can we fix the poorness? How can everybody's broke. How do we get people back to work? And the people that emerge first that want to get back to work are the Blacks and the Hispanics that are here. And they get tapped for projects. They start building things across the islands. They're back in the maritime business, so they're sponging what they can. The industry really doesn't exist anymore. Cleaning streets, building cabanas, just beautifying the island, painting houses, and it's the Black population that gets tapped for this reconstruction project. I mean, this is the aquarium being built, Key West Aquarium. This was a Great Depression project to create an attraction in Key West because we were going to become a tourist destination. That's what they decided. And they were making more tourist attractions and beautifying spaces. And the majority were the Cubans and the blacks that were going to work. And this is all the black workers constructing the Key West Aquarium and getting paid to do so. So they're willing to jump in. And again, shaping that island during one of these formative times when we really needed to, step up what Key West was doing and get the momentum going again. It's that section of the population that's doing it. Then we have World War II. On the eve of World War II, there's research and statistics about the two races. There's about 76% now whites in Key West and 24% blacks right before the Second World War. So they would get their chance to enlist at this point, and I know this is something that we've talked about quite a bit, as the Montfort Point Marines comes out, and this is something that really was not acknowledged until a few years ago, where people were volunteering from Key West to join what had been an all-white Marine Corps. And so they end up, they worked hard, they rise up in the ranks. I mean, a lot of them had gone to the Douglas School. They were very educated, but they were still only allowed menial jobs. They would never let them really rank up in the Marine Corps at all. So they usually were kept to more clerical work and here. Stateside necessarily than moving, but they're finally honored in 2011 when President Obama awarded the last remaining Marines and their families congressional gold medals for all their work and their volunteerism during that. So we have that as part of our history, again shaping that governmental and military side. And then I'll kind of wind it down because I'm almost done, but I should be done. Okay, so, but I want to give a nod to, because this talk was about shaping, right? Like that was the core of what I wanted to focus on, how these different people, these places and things had shaped it. And these black businesses in Bahama Village, we're dealing with, from 1900 to 1965 segregation. And it forces blacks to become entrepreneurs in their own neighborhoods. They can't go to the same school. It's frowned upon, the same businesses, being in the same places or not. And because of these Jim Crow laws that existed in Florida and here, this makes the blacks become not more insular in a bad way, but good because they become entrepreneurs. They're depending on themselves. They need to learn a different trade to be, to run a business, to run a grocery store, to run a bar, to become a barber, to be a seamstress, to, make ice cream, to, all sorts of wonderful things that were available in the community, and people look at the Jim Crow. Of course, it's it's terrible, but at the same time, it propelled part of the black community, particularly in Key West, to really kind of diversify what they were doing. Those same industries that they had worked in pre-Depression just didn't exist anymore, and they had to pick up and decide what there was to do. And so there was tons of black pool halls, barbershops, you name it, they had it. And that corridor, which I've learned thanks to working on this project and this exhibit, is these residents are feeling this segregation and Jim Crow, but we are a little different. But the majority of businesses are starting on Petronia Street, and Petronia and Thomas. Oh, I didn't highlight Thomas. Sorry about that. Highlight. That was like the one corner I needed to nail, and I didn't do it. Damn it. From what I understand now, this was Cup's Corner. This was Cup's Corner, and this is where everybody's business was, either personal business, business you didn't want anywhere, and it's really wonderful just because I've been trying to read and hear a lot, and people have been sharing so much, but this just becomes its own business district. Everybody goes, Duval Street over here. No, they didn't. You don't need to. This entire area and these businesses between Fort and Emma and Thomas and Whitehead and further over, because I feel like I'm kind of leaving the graveyard out of this, and I shouldn't, but again, I'm pressed for time. But again, I think it's just really impressive how they take us. The situation was taken and they shape their own Key West. Right? Like they shape their own neighborhood because they have to, and they do it really well. Right? Sorry, thanks. Thank you, John. He's like, this one has to be in there. right? So, and so becomes that Petronia Street really becomes that corridor. And okay, according to him, again, this was all called Peace Street. Was it? See? Oh, yeah. I listened to you. I got you. And so this is that economic pulse, and it's like the town center. It's the town hall. It's everything all rolled into one. And we kind of go a little bit more about this in the exhibit and talking about more personal experiences and what people remember and the businesses that are there. So we're really looking at that as part of this, like socializing and dancing and hanging out and just general, like it's where everybody was. Okay. Can I say no? So last thing I think I'm going to focus on is how they shaped Key West really is through the system of education, because at the core of everything that I've had the opportunity and too long to talk about is at the center of this is the education system. Okay, that Douglas School, it has turned out an impressive number of people who have gone on to do any number of impressive things. They've either gone into military service, they're scientists, they're doctors, they're university professors. And it's funny because Tom Hambright from the library was doing a while ago looking at people, graduates of the Douglas School versus like graduates of Key West High School, and not a success rate, but certainly notable people that emerged out of both of those schools. And far and away, Douglas School has been able to produce a greater number of people that we know what they've gone on to do, whether they've gone into science, whether they're teaching at a university, whether or not they were a Tuskegee Airman. And succeeding at that. But really at the root of all of this is that educational system, and it's this multi-generation of Black families who are committed to high levels of education and educators is really what allowed for a lot of what we've talked about to happen tonight. It wouldn't have happened without churches and the education system at its core. Which closed, and I'm going to let that go. All right, last slide. This is it. I'm done. Okay, so education is the contribution that I want to end this talk with. And there are, of course, like a lot of other things. Don't raise your hand and say, well, what about the churches? Because, listen, I've already kept you here real long. With my too much information, because there's contributions, there's art, there's religion, there's architecture, there's community, there's tourism. I could have hit on a number of these that I did not tonight, and that's not to say that any of them don't matter. It's not to say that any of them aren't equally as valid. I was looking at what was shaping Key West, and I kind of wanted to pull out those elements that I really think made this island what it is today. There are several components that I certainly just couldn't cover, but are enormously important to the development of the Black community here in Key West. So this talk really was meant to explore the patterns and somewhat difficulties in settlement here, the industries of the Black population through hard work and drive, and the multifarious contributions that really do shape our island. And this Black segment of our community, to me, deserves much credit for influencing and molding our island really what it is today. We celebrate their cultural mosaic here. We like to say one human family. Let's really mean it. But we hope I'm hoping this will shed some new light on the contributions of Black residents to our island here who have been relegated, I think, to the footnotes of most of our history books. So that's really it. Thank you.